So our first session today is Preservation 101, the basics of preservation commissions. This session will provide an overview and introduction to the roles and responsibilities of historic preservation commissions in New Hampshire. Our speakers include Brandy Laughlin, Preservation Planning and Development Coordinator within the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, and Andrew Cushing, Community Preservation Services Manager within the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. And with that, I will turn it over to Brandy and Andrew to begin. If you'd like to take control and unmute yourselves.
All right, can everyone hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, you can, and that's all that matters. Thanks, Katie.
Yes, hopefully everybody else is. If anybody wants to type in the chat, like, yes, we can hear everybody good, that would be helpful. So
I decided I'd come to Concord to do this because my Wi-Fi in my rural town doesn't always work. And it turns out there's a farmer's market happening in one corner of the office, and there's soft jazz playing. So if you guys hear saxophone, that's not me. That's someone else. What's Brandy, you think, until 9 o'clock sharp?
Yeah, if it's okay with Katie, I wouldn't mind waiting just a couple minutes if folks want to wait till 9 o'clock.
Sure, yep, only 3 minutes. So I guess we'll start right at 9 on the dot.
Awesome.
For the masses to arrive.
I guess I'd offer in the meantime, while we have this 3 minutes, if anybody on here is able or willing, please feel free to put in the chat maybe where you're from or why you chose to attend this session today, just out of general curiosity.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd also love, if people are interested in sharing what their role is in their community, if they're on their Historic District Commission or Heritage Commission or some other board, or they're a volunteer with their historical society or whatever that might be, or maybe you're just interested in the topic.
Great. Hillsborough, beautiful. Amherst, great. Nashua, all right. Danville, good. Really, this is just a chance for Brandy and I to see how experts our listeners are, because you guys are on the front lines of all of this. Beverly and Hampton Falls. Kensington and Megan. It's a party.
Andrew, do you want to also start when we do start with each of us doing a quick little description of what we do at our respective places of employment?
Yeah, I like that. We come in on Saturdays to do conferences.
Look at us.
All right. Well, we've stayed at the same number of participants. So with the by a regional planning commission. It's a good question, Will. I don't know.
I can answer that. We did have members of regional planning commissions sign up and register for this conference. I'm sure as attendees, you all know that when you registered, you don't pick the specific track that you're registering for. You got sent all the links. So while we did have members, register, I can't say right of now until we look at attendance data afterwards if there's any in this track or not.
All right. So I'd say it's 9 a.m. And we should get this show started. So Brandy from DHR and I from the Preservation Alliance are gonna go through a Preservation 101, the basics of preservation commissions for you. And we'll introduce ourselves for those, although I recognize several names on this on the attendee list. But I'll start. So the Preservation Alliance is the statewide nonprofit for historic preservation. We're membership driven. We have a couple folks in our office. Beverly in our office focuses on barns and historic homes, and then runs our Barn and Old House Expo, which is happening next year in Manchester. And then I deal with community projects, so Grange halls, churches, town halls, anything municipal or nonprofit driven is in my wheelhouse. And so I meet with groups and help them strategize both kind of preservation projects, but then sometimes fundraising and organizational capacity. So I'm in the field a lot. I've been to every town in New Hampshire at this point. So I would kill at bar trivia about New Hampshire geography, I think. We also run our 7 to Save program, which highlights the most endangered properties in New Hampshire each year. We have a Preservation Achievement Awards program, and we do a biennial conference, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end. This year, we're hosting it in Claremont, and we're very excited to show off that city's really great track record of preservation and economic development and strategic priorities. So if you're free in May 19th, come to Claremont and join us for a day of fun. Brandy.
Great. So my name is Brandy Laughlin. I work at the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, and we are the State Historic Preservation Office. So as the slide here says, we act as a liaison to the National Park Service for programs like the National Register of Historic Places, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, as well as the Certified Local Government Program. Of the 3 programs I just mentioned, I run 2 of them for the DHR. I'm in charge of the tax credit program and the Certified Local Government Program. So far in New Hampshire, we have 29 certified local governments, which is very exciting. And our certified local government program, I see we definitely have some folks in attendance that are part of that program. And that program allows us to pass on some, we have a limited amount, but some grant funding for things like survey, National Register listings, and other preservation related projects. Our office also provides consultation for federal undertakings under Section 106. That's probably a term that folks have heard thrown around quite a bit, but essentially what that is a federal law that requires any projects that have federal licensing, permitting, or funding to be reviewed under that law. And our office does have a role in that review, a consultation role in that review. And you all, as local representatives or board members in your community, also have a stake and a role in that review as well. So if you have questions about that, please reach out to our office. So I will leave it at that, and we'll roll on through the slides.
All right. So we're going to start with just some, I'm going to introduce kind of the concept of preservation, why we do it, and why it's important, and also touch on why we don't do it. So really, I think it's about sharing stories, right? So we want to save resources that help us connect to the past and help us leave the continued kind of narrative of our history and our stories to the future. In New Hampshire, our diverse heritage is it's not like the American. I'd say, let me rephrase that. When we talk about honoring our diverse heritage, New Hampshire has great stories about especially French Canadians, about Shakers. It really ranges, especially in your community. So we want to make sure that there's built environment that reflects those stories, both to honor the past and to inform the future. We want to support sound community planning and development. So preservation is a land use, especially preservation boards or land use boards. So we are absolutely involved in how our towns plan and how our built environment reflects those values of our community. It's about maintaining community character and supporting livability. So if you think about what communities the state of New Hampshire and the advertising board shares to posters in the subway system at New York City, it's seldom maybe Salem's strip developments of malls, but it's often, the village scenes that we have, the farm scenes that we have, the mill yards that really reflect our state and kind of help people imagine what New Hampshire is. And then supporting sustainability. So this is not news that preservation is really tied to our carbon footprint and how the greenest building is often the one that already exists. So when we think about what materials from especially pre-1940, the high quality of those materials, we just don't often get those back. So there's this idea of embodied energy with our historic buildings. That is pretty substantial in terms of that carbon sink. When we demolish old buildings and use that landfill space for those and we construct new, it's very energy intensive. So there's certainly an economic argument and an environmental impact argument for historic preservation. So really, preservation means kind of managing this change. We're not here to restrict change, but we're here to manage it. So we're looking at ways of maybe sometimes compromising, maybe sometimes negotiating, but ultimately making sure that our villages, our historic districts are there to adapt to the times and kind of control how we want to see our towns look. We want to keep buildings in active use. So again, sometimes this means compromising, sometimes it means adaptations, but we want to make sure that our buildings are able to sustain modern populations so that more people can appreciate them and become champions of these buildings in the next generation. We want to, again, save those resources for future generations. We've talked about this. The preservation is really not just about the past, it's certainly about the future as well. And then ensuring a record of yesterday's materials, designs, craftsmanship. Our buildings, again, embody so much, not just energy, but really stories. And this whole record of beautiful craftsmanship, to borrow that kind of adage that no one builds anything like they used to. It seems especially prescient when we're looking at when new developments, lots of vinyl siding and plywood and vinyl windows. It doesn't have quite the same character that we're really familiar with and like to uphold. I think I can move this way. We touched on this a little bit, but preservation does not mean keeping buildings and neighborhoods under this bell jar, right? This kind of frozen in amber mentality that we might have. Very few buildings are precious enough and museum quality enough that we can't allow them to change and adapt to our modern livings. We just want to be able to kind of control them in a way that helps preserve property values, maintain those stories of yesterday for tomorrow, etc. A lot of times I think preservation is brought into this NIMBY mindset where we, not even preservationists, but folks might use preservation to stall projects or to prevent projects from happening at all. We want to always make sure that preservation is at the table in having these conversations, but is used appropriately, and also in a way that allows your commission to continue, right? So sometimes, as you know, there might have to be some decisions made that you're not really proud of, but it might allow your commission to not to use this kind of pugilistic fighting mentality, but to lose the battle, but to win the war. A lot of our historic district commissions were created in the 60s and 70s. This is a time when we were really dealing with this bicentennial fervor and a really strong reaction to urban renewal and efforts to dramatically change our landscape. And so some of our earlier ordinances and regulations are pretty strict and not in keeping with what we might consider today's best practices. So historic district commissions, we encourage them not to really focus on aesthetics and opinions, paint colors, but to really think about enforceable, defensible decisions based in your ordinance, which is hopefully about really design guidelines and kind of the big picture of your district. Paint colors are reversible. Things like vinyl siding and replacement windows are not always reversible. And then lastly, preservation doesn't really mean or shouldn't mean promoting a false sense of history. So I know that there are different, I'd say, interpretations of new construction designs, and we'll get into that later in the day. But architecture is an evolving field. So we want to make sure that, again, we're just managing change. We're not stalling or preventing change. I think I run across this false sense of history a lot in my site visits on individual buildings, where we have maybe some rosy pictures of what the past was like. I think it's always important to remember why things have changed from yesterday, right? I think I have a picture here of a schoolhouse. We definitely have these romantic ideas of what schoolhouses were like, thanks to Currier and Ives. But the reality is that schoolhouses were pretty tough places, right? Ventilation was not great, sanitation was not great, daylight was not great, and up until the 1880s, individual districts within a town had control over how much they would spend. So quality of education varied greatly within towns. So there's a reason that we progress. And I think if you're doing, say, a schoolhouse museum, you should also talk about how female teachers were paid far less than their male counterparts. Things like this. We don't want to try to create a false sense of our history. So Brandy and I are going to talk about the nuts and bolts of these preservation commissions, which is really historic district commissions, heritage commissions too, if you are in a merged situation. So we'll touch briefly on the differences between historic district commissions and those heritage commissions. We'll talk about the makeup of those commissions and what they look like in terms of size and expertise. And then the ordinances, the rules of procedures that really help you make defensible, enforceable decisions. And allow homeowners who live in the district to know exactly what they're dealing with and how they can make their best presentations to your board. And then what kind of support exists for the commissions. Historic district commissions have not really been, I'd say, recipients of good regular training, and we're hoping to change that at the state level so that we can offer more regularized training for you, because you're really doing important work. And we want to make sure you have the support you need, especially when emergencies or situations come up. So apples and oranges, heritage commissions versus historic district commissions. They're both considered land use boards. Historic district commissions are in charge of enforceable and regulatory powers. So you are making the real land use decisions based on a defined boundary for your area. Heritage commissions are considered more advisory and have a larger scope because you're focusing on the town. So you're encouraging good preservation activity and education on a town-wide scale. Again, these can be merged, which means sometimes you have to wear different hats. but they do distinct things. Historic district commissions in New Hampshire, enabling legislation was passed in the 60s, kind of following this, again, reaction to urban renewal and this idea that, boy, preservation is probably a public purpose or a common good for our people. So if you read the RSAs, it provides these reasons for why historic district commissions exist and why the Supreme Court in New Hampshire has consistently upheld historic district commissions' existence. So a lot of these, if you look in your own bylaws or your own documents, probably drafted decades ago, but hopefully reviewed every now and then, you'll see these tenets of historic district commissions. And so it's for reflecting the elements of cultural, social, economic, political, community, and architectural history in your district, conserving property values, fostering civic beauty, strengthening the local economy, and promoting the use of historic districts for education, pleasure, and welfare of the citizens of your municipality. Excuse me. In this HDC role, then, you're in charge of a couple things. So there's this idea of stewardship. This idea of, my notes have disappeared on this slide, but you're kind of stewards of these historic properties and landmarks. You're here for a bit, but the buildings are here a lot longer than you are, including me. This idea of planning, so making sure that any district or maybe future districts have been surveyed, inventoried, that you're supporting inventory even planning outside of your district. And heritage commissions are really great partners in this process. Brandy can talk a little bit about that in upcoming slides. And then the kind of less fun, but really important element of your commission responsibilities are this enforcement of the ordinances and the regulations that you have impacted. And I know that over the years, ordinance enforcement goes up and down. It's sometimes personality driven. And sometimes there are kind of outside forces. Like right now, we're dealing with a housing crisis. So there's a lot more political pressure to allow housing developments that might not really fit the district's ordinances. But there's great pressure to do so in order to meet a real critical need in New Hampshire. So how do we enforce the ordinances fairly, especially over the decades? And what do you do then if maybe 10 years ago, certain ordinances were not enforced as strongly as new members would like to do it now? It can be a real pickle for everyone. I mentioned that our HDC enabling legislation was passed in the 1960s. So your real block of RSAs that dictate what you can do and why you can do it, you're going to look in 673:4. Well, I'm not even going to read them out, so you can see them on the slide there. So it's a great idea to review those every now and then, just to kind of reinforce why you exist and what powers you have according to the state statutes. New Hampshire has about 55 historic district commissions right now. Again, it goes up and down through the years. We've lost some, and we've gained some. Our more recent ones include Enfield, Conway, Bristol is fairly new. And then we have some real long-term ones that have been around since the 60s when the state passed that enabling legislation. You can see here that we have our smallest historic district is in Dorchester, population about 340. And then our largest city, Manchester, regulates its Millyard area. I think this is true, the only city in New Hampshire that does not have a historic district commission is Berlin. And you can see that there's kind of this divide south of the notches and north of the notches where we have historic preservation commissions. If you look around the state, this is kind of the benefit of my position. I meet with a lot of HDCs. Some groups are really regulating just a few buildings, maybe a town hall and a church, for example. And others are regulating entire neighborhoods that can be mixed use, they can be pretty dense, and they can be all sorts of architectural styles. So depending on your community's appetite, you might have a very different experience than your neighboring community. And then we talked about this, HDCs can be merged with heritage commissions. And this is popular both in, Manchester has a combined HDC-HC, and then also Dorchester on the other end has a combined HC-HDC. So it's about the appetite and the interest of your community and what you think these tools work best for you. Depending on maybe the size of your community, you'll notice that HDCs can range from 3 to 7 members with up to 5 alternates. According to the RSAs, one of those members should always be a selectman or a city councilor or a town councilor. And then a planning board member may be another member of your board. And then the rest are appointed experts in your community. So unlike other town boards where everyone is elected, your historic district commission or your heritage commission members are going to be appointed based on your familiarity with architectural history, architecture, maybe the trades, something that allows you to make educated opinions when you're weighing these applications that come across your desk. And Brandy now is going to go through those RSAs and give some nitty-gritty details to what I've kind of laid out in the big picture. So Brandy, you want to take control?
All right, thank you, Andrew. So thank you everybody again for joining us today. We are really excited to be offering this track as part of the conference this year, and we hope to fine-tune it and continue to present in future years. So I'm going to be covering some basic meat and potatoes aspects of historic district ordinances and procedures. In preparing this presentation, I assumed that we would have a mixed audience of attendees from communities with long-established historic districts, some newly adopted historic districts, and some communities who are maybe in the exploration stage of potentially establishing a historic district. So for those of you who are in the newer or not yet established categories, please know that, as Katie said, these recordings will be available, so you are welcome to rewatch and take notes and refer back to them at any time. And for those of you who are in the longer established category, I hope that this session can still be helpful for you. And I just always want to note that Andrew and I work professionally in preservation, but we are not necessarily, the experts on this, on local preservation. All of you all who volunteer in your communities and hold these positions are doing this work every day. And I get calls and emails, I wouldn't say daily, but pretty close to it, where each community kind of has something a little bit different about them, or a situation that's a little bit different. So we are happy to provide guidance and answer questions to the best of our ability. But I also encourage you all to maybe make note of who are in these sessions and maybe reach out to your fellow board members in other communities to see, how they may have handled the situation, or, how they are handling things too. For, those well-established communities, it also might be worth it for this particular session to take some notes and consider auditing your existing ordinance if it hasn't been updated in a while. So we'll talk about that as well. So before I launch into the kind of nitty-gritty of it all, here is a very oversimplified process of creating a historic district and a historic district commission. The process for a heritage commission that also serves as a historic district review board is going to be more or less the same. So again, I just want to acknowledge those combined heritage commissions and HDCs. So the first thing you want to do is define the goals and purpose of the HDC. And then the municipal council or the town will vote to create the district and the commission that will oversee it. Generally, these districts are created as a zoning overlay, which I'll talk about in another slide. For an HGC as opposed to a Heritage Commission or an HGC combined with a Heritage Commission, this vote will also include the delineation of the HGC's review powers, geographically and otherwise. So basically laying out where exactly that district exists on a map and on the ground. Then members and alternates are appointed by town council or selectmen. Always request administrative support from your town, and that goes for new and long-established boards. And then members will draft and adopt official regulations and rules of procedure. And we always recommend no fewer than 4 meetings a year. I know that some HGCs find that they don't have that many applicants. You know, maybe their district is small or there just aren't that many changes happening in it. But we still recommend that you meet at least 4 times a year just to check in with each other, and maybe do one of the other activities that you are enabled to do as a historic district commission. So in my portion of this, I'm also going to be covering the actual ordinance. So recommended elements of a historic district ordinance, recommended elements of HDC procedures and regulations, examples of design guidelines in New Hampshire, and recommended practices for applications and resulting certificates of approval. And I'm just going to take a minute here quickly to say, whenever I say HDC or Historic District Commission, I just want to be clear that I am covering both HDCs and Heritage Commissions that serve as HDCs as well. Just be quicker for me to say HDC. Okay, so let's get into it. Historic district ordinances are meant to help preserve the character of a designated area. And it is important to reiterate here that the purpose of a historic district is not to keep the district frozen in time, but instead to manage change in a way that ensures it is considerate of the historic nature and character of the district. Building on this, the ordinance must not be so restrictive that it deprives a property owner, that it deprives a property owner of all reasonable, there we go. Sorry, guys. Of all reasonable economic use of the property. And just like all other land use regulations in the United States, it must honor a citizen's constitutional right to due process. Fair hearings must be provided and rational procedures must be followed. Commitment to fair hearings must be included in the ordinance, and the HDC procedures should include details for such processes. In New Hampshire, all land use regulations are granted to municipalities through enabling legislation, and as such, all HDC ordinances and procedures must comply with relevant state laws. In New Hampshire, local historic districts generally take the form of a zoning overlay. And generally, the underlying zoning requirements govern dimension and other features like setbacks, lot coverage, and use, among others. And the historic district overlay allows the HDC to review design features like form, fenestration, scale, pattern, and materials, among other things. Having a separate overlay district means that historic districts can cover multiple underlying zones that may have differing characteristics, such as commercial, residential, mixed use, etc. There are some communities in New Hampshire where the historic district functions as its own zoning layer. However, those are in the minority, and we always recommend an overlay use as a historic district. All preservation ordinances should have a statement of purpose that outlines the justification and goals of the ordinance. This example is from Exeter, and you can see that it calls out the several goals, including property values, civic pride, general preservation values, and the education, pleasure, and welfare of the citizens of Exeter. Having a good statement of purpose, always helps lend credibility and grounds for justification in some decision making. And you'll hear me say grounds for justification quite a few times here. It's always good to remember, the RSAs are very important for you to look at regularly to remind yourself and others of the rights that you have as an HGC. And we also have making good decisions, which I believe is the next session, so stick around for that. A preservation ordinance should also have language establishing and designating the body that will have oversight in the historic district. This can take the form of the Historic District Commission, excuse me, or the powers can be designated to a Heritage Commission, as we discussed. For the purposes of this presentation, again, I'll be using the term Historic District Commission or HDC to mean whatever body it is that has the review authority in a local historic district. And again, you'll note that a lot of these samples that we're using refer to the RSAs again. And here we have Bedford's establishment. It is important that your ordinance call out the powers and duties of the governing board, the Historic District Commission in this case. This section of your ordinance is your opportunity to ensure strong language that supports your authority and role in local government. Never forget that local historic districts and the boards that review them have just as much right to existence and respect as your Conservation Commission, Zoning Board, Planning Board, and other boards and committees in your community. This is something that we struggle with, and we hear very often from folks that serve on their local HDCs, but it is important to remember that you are right there on the RSAs with these other land use boards, and you were created in your community for a reason. So at its core, a historic district is a collection of historic resources linked by a location or theme. When establishing a new historic district, it is useful to have a clear set of criteria for determining the makeup and boundaries of that district. Now, we have a lot of existing historic districts in New Hampshire, and often when districts are created, they're based on just kind of like what people see as the obvious geographical boundaries, which is usually when maybe an architectural style changes or a date, timeline of buildings change, or maybe when much newer construction has happened at the around the edges of a district. What we don't have in a lot of communities is a set of criteria for designating new historic districts. So if at any point in time your community was interested in expanding a new district or your current district, or your community that doesn't have a district yet, but you're looking at creating one, it is really important to consider also establishing criteria for designating those districts, whether they're new or expanding. So by creating that set of criteria and the procedures for designating that historic district, you just add another layer of credibility and justification for the existence of the district. Often these criteria for designation boil down to what exactly makes the district a cohesive district. Examples of things that may tie a group together include a group of buildings that all relate to a specific historic context. For example, a town center that includes a collection of public use buildings like a church, a town hall, a fire station, a general store, etc. including maybe the town green, an old town pound, that kind of thing. A group of buildings that were constructed for the same purpose or related purposes, such as a mill complex and or associated mill housing, worker housing. Or even a neighborhood that sprouted around a particular boom in growth. You could think maybe like a streetcar suburb or post-war ranches in subdivisions from the late 40s and 50s. And yes, at this point, those are historic. So on the slide here, you can see a couple of criteria. So a geographically definable area in which a majority of the properties in the district are at least 50 years old, and a majority of the properties in the district retain a high degree of integrity that clearly conveys its historical significance, and which possess a significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of building structures, sites, or objects, united by past events, plan, or physical development, such as the examples that I gave, display significant character, interest, or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of a community. Sometimes there's an ethnic thread tying a district together. Exemplify cultural, political, economic, social, or historical heritage of the community. So again, I think most communities in New Hampshire do not have or have not adopted specific criteria for designating, but it's absolutely something I would love to see folks to start exploring.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Brandy, too, that we see a lot of towns that are newly considering HDCs. They kind of put their toe in the water and they maybe designate a few really obvious, often institutional buildings. And then as people get more comfortable with the idea, they'll expand the boundaries. We haven't always gotten to that second step, but it is a good way for a town to, again, kind of feel it out.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very common way that we hear of folks establishing districts. You know, starting again with those very clear public use kind of districts, and then noting that, well, these buildings here are kind of associated, or were built around the same timeline, that kind of thing. So all historic district ordinances should be as explicit and clear as possible about what kind of activities will trigger review by the HDC. This will ensure that your jurisdiction and authority are not left up to interpretation. We do have a lot of communities that have older districts and maybe their ordinance or regulations haven't been updated recently. And there can be some gray areas and some question about what your jurisdiction and authority really are. So, this might be the time to look at your existing language and maybe update it to be as clear as possible, so that there aren't questions about what exactly triggers your review and authority. This also creates transparency and predictability for property owners in the district. That's another thing you're going to hear me say several times in this presentation, is creating transparency and predictability for property owners. I think that is the greatest tool that an HDC can have and can put into place, because by creating that, you create a sense of trust with the property owners, and you absolutely make the process smoother on everybody's end. Common activities that trigger review include any pulling of a building permit, construction of a new building or addition, changing of roof, siding, or windows and signage. And it's important to remember that reviewing new construction within the district is just as important as reviewing the changes to the historic buildings within that district, because part of what makes your district special is the overall character. And new construction can cause big changes if the character is not respected, and if the new building is not designed appropriately. Again, having clear standards for review in your ordinance will continue that path of transparency and predictability for property owners. It will also help inform the creation of design guidelines, which can take even more of the guessing out of the process. I will touch on design guidelines in a couple of slides, but for now, let's talk about standards for review in your actual ordinance. So this example is from Amherst and includes reference to the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. The Secretary of the Interior standards has 4 categories of standards: preservation, restoration, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. The rehabilitation standards are the most widely used and referred to, and they allow for flexibility and adaptation. However, remember that the goal of the HGC is to thoughtfully manage change and not prevent it, which is why we often recommend that boards look at the rehabilitation standards as a basis for their standards for review. So these 6 criteria shown here, again from Amherst, are reflective of 6 of the 10 standards for rehabilitation and cover general guiding principles. This lays the foundation of expectations in the ordinance, and then these can be expanded upon and further illustrated in design guidelines that are adopted by the HGC after the ordinance is established. All ordinances should have language in them that point to or describe the proper legal appeal process. This goes for HGCs, zoning board, planning board, etc. It's just kind of that standard, boilerplate kind of language, but it's got to be in there. In the case of historic districts, the prescribed appeals process is to the zoning board. And in cases where there is no zoning board, a process is prescribed in RSA 677-18. And that involves a rehearing and ultimately an appeal in Superior Court. New Hampshire enabling legislation also lays out ways to enforce and address violations of the requirements of the ordinance. I do want to acknowledge that this is often a difficult process and can sometimes be arduous to follow up or follow through with, depending on the resources available to your board or your community, your town or city. And we often hear from communities who feel like they have to pick their battles, as Andrew mentioned earlier. But it is important to remember that the state has enabled you to enforce your ordinance and address violations, and you do have the right and authority to do so. If you have to pick your battle, that's totally understandable. But when you pick that battle, you have the RSAs behind you, as one of your tools for that. And again, the clearer all of these other elements that we've discussed, the clearer these are in your ordinance, again, the more tools you'll have in your battle to justify and defend your decisions or unfortunately sometimes your existence. So in addition to adopting an actual ordinance, which again, generally, so the ordinance is going to be adopted the same way that a zoning ordinance or other land use ordinance would be adopted in your community. So if you're a town, usually that's town vote or city council or whatever the case might be. In addition to adopting that actual ordinance, which lays the legal foundation, the HGC should also create and adopt regulations and rules of procedures. So ordinances contain the elements that we just discussed, but the regulations or procedures are adopted by a vote of the HGC itself. This still requires a public hearing, But it's essentially the HGC deciding on how they are going to carry out the authorities and responsibilities that were given to them in the ordinance. So in general, regulations govern the content of review, and many include the procedure for that review as well. They expand upon the details of the items in the ordinance, but they can't expand the authority. Some communities also adopt separate rules of procedures that specify how meetings will be run, maybe establish a code of ethics for board members, outline other procedural items that the HGC will adhere to. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to refer to a document that contains both the content of procedure for review, the content of and procedure for review as HGC regulations. So again, regardless of the form they take, these documents create additional clarity and predictability for both the board and property owners within the district. HGCs are also enabled by state law to participate in the building permit review process, and this is usually the biggest way that HGCs kind of carry out their review authority is through usually, the building permit is what triggers their review. State law also lays out the timeline and process for the HGC's participation in the building permit process. Excuse me. So this usually takes the form of requiring application to the HGC, review by the HGC, and ultimately receiving a certificate of approval or appropriateness from the HGC. It is very important to note here that over here, let's see, I'll try this laser pointer out here. This section right here, that the Historic District Commission shall file a certificate of approval or notice of disapproval within 45 days after the filing of the application for certificate, unless the applicant agrees to a longer period of time. We have known of instances where communities have unfortunately not answered or approved or disproved or whatever the case might be, taken action on an application within 45 days. And at that point, unfortunately, they essentially forfeited their right to review. So all HGC procedures should clearly lay out the process for review, as well as the requirements for what needs to be submitted as part of an application. This example here is from Claremont and shows some pretty common requirements. So a completed application form, a narrative description of the project, graphic materials of sufficient clarity and detail. This can refer to plans, elevations, perspectives, photos, etc. that are mentioned at the bottom here, or any other material that the applicant thinks the board might find helpful. And then you can see in the snapshot of the application on the right side here that they include a pretty detailed but succinct list of requirements. It's definitely a balancing act between being detailed enough that things are clear and understandable and thorough without kind of going overboard and bogging people down with too many details about what's required. This example here is very helpful. And I also encourage you all to just go look around at other communities, what they have on their websites for applications, or what their ordinance looks like, or their regulations, or rules of procedures. It's always really helpful to see what other people are doing and see if there's something that might be a good thing to implement in your community. So these review procedures here, I took from the town of Sandwich from their website. It's a pretty streamlined approach to review procedures. So you can see that they put, critical need to know information covered in a very short introduction and 6 kind of bullet point components. So makeup of the board and requirement for a quorum, meeting days and times, acknowledging their need to comply with open meeting and right to know laws, applications and fees, timeline and method of communication of commission findings, appeals process, enforcement, and when applications are required. Again, this is very, very succinct, which is, I think, sometimes very helpful, and there might be more detailed versions of this. So some communities might have that more detailed version in their full review procedures. That it also might include your code of ethics, your reference for how votes should be made, meeting procedures, rules and terms for officers and other items. But it can be also helpful to include a brief summary of procedures like this within that document so that you can pull it out and use it specifically in your public engagement. Design guidelines. We have a lot of communities who have adopted design guidelines in recent years, and we have heard that they have found it very helpful, not only to the applicants themselves, but also to the board, to the review board, because it really ensures that everyone is on the same page and things are just much more detailed and supportable when it comes to decision making. So we highly recommend that your HDC consider adopting design guidelines, again, to help further clarify expectations within your district. Your ordinance will lay out a set of general principles that will be taken into account when you're reviewing work in the district, but it can't be, it can't be as detailed and long as design guidelines can be. So design guidelines really further detail exactly what the HDC is looking for when they're reviewing an application. This example here is from Rye, and it shows a portion of their illustrated guidelines. You can see in the section addressing additions to existing buildings that they give several illustrations that show appropriate and inappropriate addition designs. And again, in each case, they call out the qualities that make the designs appropriate or inappropriate, including scale, massing, location, design elements, and materials. For the sign guidance, they show several examples of types of appropriate signage and then call out the qualities that make the signs appropriate, including lighting elements, materials, scale, and location. And then in the exterior woodwork section, they not only give specific instructions for acceptable work, but they also offer helpful guidance for routine maintenance and repair best practices. And the opportunity to provide additional helpful information like this not only helps to educate the property owners in the district, but it can also help stave off maybe larger requests for changes in the future if they're able to better maintain their building now in an approachable way without having to kind of do too much work to figure out how to do that. If you give them information and make it easy for them to understand how to care for their buildings, it can definitely make things easier for everyone in the long run.
And I would say, Brandy, sorry to,
Yeah.
I mean, just to reinforce that design guidelines are kind of an additional supplementary part of your ordinance and regulations, and they often are produced by a paid consultant, right? So
Yes.
they cost money because they are tailored to your community and the types of materials or designs that are prevalent in your regulated district. But there's opportunity to get help paying for these design guidelines, correct?
Yes. So so the design guidelines are, yes, you generally want them prepared by a preservation professional, and having them tailored to your community is really what makes them most effective. So through the certified local government program, if you are a certified local government, you can apply to our office for grant funds to help pay for creation of design guidelines. If you are not a certified local government, we don't necessarily at DHR have grants that are available to you, but we may be able to point you to resources where you may be able to find them. And while I do not encourage plagiarism, there is also no need to reinvent the wheel. So you can always look around at what other communities have, and maybe try to build your, build some design guidelines, basic ones, and include, the same kind of information or helpful information that you may see in other communities with similar building types or similar districts. So just a quick little plug for the Certified Local Government Program while I'm talking about it. In New Hampshire, the main requirement to be a certified local government is to have a locally regulated historic district. There are a few other requirements, but that is kind of the main one. So for those of you who are on our sessions today, and if your community has a locally regulated historic district, which I'm assuming you do, given that's the focus, or if you're thinking about creating one, you're welcome to reach out to me and ask questions, or I can give you information about the Certified Local Government Program and if you might be eligible and what the process is like to apply. So again, just back to the design guidelines, the more detailed design guidelines not only give property owners a very clear direction to go in when considering their project, but they also create the foundation of predictable and defensible decisions for the HDC. Again, every time you're making a decision, you want to think back to your RSAs, your ordinance, your regulations, your rules of procedure, and if you do have design guidelines, those two, what in each of those categories supports the decision that you're about to make. And, if you can check some boxes, mentally, yes, 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 then you should be in good shape if somebody ever challenges your decision. All right. So I know that we just kind of flew through a little bit of that, but I think we've got some good questions that we can talk about at the end. And Andrew and I are both always available if you have specific questions related to your community or your HTC. So you're welcome to reach out to us about that. So let's talk more about a larger part of being a board in your community, and that's creating goodwill through outreach and public engagement. While a majority of your role is going to be regulatory, there is also an inherent responsibility to foster a general appreciation for preservation in your community. Not only will that make your job easier, frankly, if people understand and appreciate why it is important, it also it's just a responsibility that you have as a preservation-minded person. So there are a lot of ways to do this. Having, a page on your website, social media presence, introducing yourself to other town officials and board and commission members, as well as town staff. Be willing and prepared to offer assistance or information about your HGC's mission and goals. Having a good working relationship with other boards and commissions in your town is really, really important. It is not unusual that you are working on reviewing and approving community projects at the same time with maybe the zoning board or planning board or both. So having a good working relationship, can help avoid some bumps where maybe you approve something, the planning board, says, oh, we want you to do this. So then they have to come back to you, or vice versa. So it's always a good idea to foster those relationships. And then reaching out to community groups like Historical Society, Main Street Organization, business groups, and others. Again, always helps to humanize you as board members, and kind of spread those values of preservation in your community. I just wanted to highlight some other project ideas that you might want to consider, because again, while most of your work is going to be regulatory, if you've got time to do some other projects, or whether you're just an HGC, whether you're a combined HGC and Heritage Commission. If you are just an HGC and you have a Heritage Commission, maybe you can team up with them on projects. Anything that you can do to, again, get yourself out there and seen in a different light other than saying yes or no, essentially. Designing exhibits or offering programs on local history. We see a lot of folks who maybe will do signage in town hall or in a library or some kind of display in a school. Managing and starting appropriate social media accounts. Creating a resource center for property owners. I think this is a really great tool that I'd love to see more communities consider. And that could just be pointing to resources on your website, pointing to the Secretary of the Interior standards. The National Park Service has a really great set of illustrated guidelines to the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. So if you don't want to, reinvent the wheel, you can at least point people to that as a great resource. Knowing where to send them when you don't know the answers is always very helpful. Sometimes if you have a lot of, clapboard sided buildings in your community, it might be helpful to have resources about, how to appropriately remove paint or repair clapboards or whatever the case might be. Encourage your town to adopt preservation-friendly legislation like 79E and 79D. I won't go too much into those, but they're essentially property tax related for preservation of certain kinds of historic properties and projects. Host workshops for owners of historic properties, how to research the history of your property, weatherization for historic buildings, how to identify architectural styles in your community, that kind of thing. And often you can find a partnership with schools, youth programs, senior programs, or maybe your local historical society, and they can help and you can help, or you could come together to put on those workshops or create that design exhibit, or put together that resource center. Recognizing historic buildings or events with a plaque program. Everybody loves a plaque. Start a preservation awards program. Write articles and press releases for your local news. Design and publicize a walking tour. Everybody loves a walking tour too. Keep that in mind. And if you're regulating a local district, you should know enough about those buildings that you could probably put a walking tour together. And partner with other boards and commissions to create overlapping projects. We have quite a few communities I'm aware of where the Conservation Commission will pair up with the Heritage Commission often to do projects, and those are always great to see too. So again, you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with your RSAs and your HGC ordinance and regulations. If you ever have a question about, can we do that? How do we say that? Whatever the case might be, always just go back and look at the RSAs and your ordinance and your regulations. Sometimes it's helpful for me to pretend I'm writing a paper and I have to cite my source. So when you're making your decisions, if that's a trick that'll help, please use it. Review your ordinances and regulations regularly and consider, updating them if they're old and not very clear, or you feel they could be better. And consider your boundary changes as well for your district. Sometimes there have been so many changes over the years that maybe the district has shrunk. Or maybe some, kind of fringe, buildings that when the district was initially established weren't quite old enough, or, maybe weren't really considered in the same context as we might look at them now. Maybe it's time that that you consider expanding your district. We have quite a few areas. For example, Lebanon recently did an updated survey of their district, and they started looking at it through the lens of urban renewal and more modern development. And they found that the changes that happened during urban renewal, while maybe not ideal at the time, still have resulted in a recognizable pattern of development that could be contributing to their district at this time. So keep that stuff in mind. Attend workshops and trainings like today. Thank you very much for coming. And if you want more, go ahead and ask. Again, build relationships with your residents in your district, your property owners, town staff, other town boards, statewide contacts, and your neighboring HGCs. Consider becoming a CLG, and if you already are one, seek funding for more survey work or design guidelines. I'm your gal for that. And if you feel like you are a community who's doing pretty well and you could help others, maybe consider hosting workshops or presentations to maintain and develop support for your HGC. And that could be for, people in your community, or maybe even other communities, throughout the state, if you're willing to invite them to participate, or maybe kind of have a meeting of the minds about things. You know what? Andrew, I think it's your turn.
Again, I think we can reiterate that there's help for you if you need it. So feel free to reach out to folks like Katie well, you guys change your name often, but the Office of Planning and Development, with their new website is launched. DHR, so Brandy is a great resource, but there are other colleagues at DHR who would be there to answer your questions. Certainly the Preservation Alliance fields a lot of questions, and sometimes we bounce the ball back and forth between DHR and our office, because some of these questions can be really weedy and specific, and there are no precedents. We've run into those. And then your municipal body should certainly look at becoming members of the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions. It's not terribly expensive, and it gives you a wealth of resources, including kind of a listserv forum to ask other experts and kind of crowdsource answers for your problems. Here's our contact information. So you can find us online too. I want to make sure we get to the next slide so we can also answer some questions that have popped up in the chat. But then one last plug, if you are interested, our preservation conference is coming up in Claremont in less than a month. It includes tours of their downtown and some really great sessions with some really good speakers. So you should certainly put that on your calendar. We'd love to see you there. So Megan, I got a question from you from Kensington asking about kind of the creation of a historic district commission. And I can answer that really quickly. Brandy, definitely chime in if you want. If you have a town meeting format type of government, creating a historic district commission is not an overnight process. So we've dealt with this with communities where there's maybe a Dollar General that wants to come into town, and community members think an HDC might be a good way to prevent that. But it often takes 2 annual meeting cycles to get an HDC up and running. So the first year, you're creating the body. So you're voting to establish a historic district commission of 3, 5, or 7 members. And then that next year, that body is recommending an ordinance that will also go through the planning board. So there's some public meetings involved, and the town is ultimately approving the ordinance. The regulations, which Brandy talked about, which are kind of the weedier things about windows or siding or fencing, that can be decided internally, but then discussed in public meetings for approval by that body. So it's a 2-year process for a town with town meeting. If you have a city government format, it can be a lot quicker. So Laconia is a new HDC. They were able to establish theirs with some downtown threats that they were facing. And it took certainly lobbying of their city councilors, but they were able to pass it and have that body established in months versus years. So I hope that answers your question. And then Will from Amherst, right, asked, this is probably a Brandy DHR question, asking about archaeological sites that have been surveyed and inventoried, and if there are protections for those sites beyond an HDC regulatory power. So it's outside of the boundary, right? But you're still looking for what kind of protections might exist for an archaeological site.
That is a very good question, and not being an archaeologist, I don't want to steer you wrong. I do know that there are laws about digging on state property, and I don't know if that extends explicitly to generally public property, which would include your town-owned property. I would recommend that for a good answer to this, you reach out to either Mark Doporalski, he's our state archaeologist. And if you can't get a hold of him, he probably would refer you to Tanya Krajcik. She's our our deputy state archaeologist. So I would absolutely get clarification from either of those. And I can pop their contact information in the chat, or at least a link to our website with their information.
Yeah, my gut says that the town could probably pass an ordinance just like you can't drink on town property, that you can't dig and metal detect on town property, especially properties that have been determined archaeologically significant. So,
I mean, I would think in general that like you don't want people digging holes around your parks or whatever anyway, regardless of what, the reasoning for it. So I would agree with you, Andrew, that probably you could do that as well. But given again how long sometimes it can take to get something passed, maybe there is an interim answer too. So.
And we actually have 4 other questions that were submitted. I know we have a hard stop at 10:15, so we only have 2 minutes. So, and I see somebody else just submitted a question. So what I'll just suggest to everybody is if you have any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I am noting them all separately. And what I can do is, if it's okay with Brandy and Andrew, I can actually send them these questions. They can, the ones they haven't answered, they could write like a little short answer or even provide contact information, and then I can provide that back to everybody after this presentation, like next week, if that's okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. So I guess do you guys want to talk more? We maybe time for one more question before our 10:15 stop.
I can address Tony's question in a second.
Great, do it.
Tony, neighborhood heritage districts are a slightly different tool by the planning board, and we're going to discuss that in an upcoming session. Is it the next? It's in the early afternoon, 12:45 to 2 on alternatives to historic district commissions. So there is a difference. You can learn about it this afternoon.
Okay. Perfect. And since we're at 10:14, I think, like I said, I had 4 other questions that were submitted to me separate for this session. So I'll just save those. I'll send them to Andrew and Brandy. They can answer them, and then we'll provide that to everybody in the session afterwards. So I apologize that we ran out of time, but we are on a schedule. I know it was just such an interesting session. It's, there's all these questions and it's fun to learn so much, especially like me. I don't work with this, in the historic realm on a day-to-day. So I really have enjoyed listening and learning all of this today. So with that, thank you, Andrew and Brandy, again. We're leading into our first break, which is from 10:15 to 10:30. So with that, enjoy your break. And for those who are staying to join us for our second session, that will begin at 10:30.